Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I get to introduce one of my allies, Jilliane Yawney. She's the founder of Jilliane Yawney Coaching and Consulting and has founded one of the largest story slams in Canada. As a non prescriptive speaking coach who is focused on empowering corporate teams in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, Jillian turns scientists and engineers into confident speakers and storytellers. She rejects old school public speaking that is nitpicky, prescriptive, and let's be honest, wants every person to sound like a dominant extrovert with a deep voice. Her work is focused on helping each individual find comfort using their voice in a creative and thoughtful way so that teams can excel and you can sleep that night after you give your presentation. Well, welcome, Jillian. So tell us a little bit more about how you discovered your passion or your niche.
It's a long story for me because this story started when I was really quite young. When I was a teenager, I went on a road trip across Canada and I attended a festival, and it was a storytelling festival. I'd never been to a storytelling festival before. And when the first storyteller walked on stage, I was immediately gripped. I was just transfixed. She was an incredible storyteller. I'd never seen anything like it before. I came home from that event and immediately signed up for speech arts and drama lessons. So I was a teenager at the time, and it was just a few years later that I started doing my undergrad in performing arts. And I have this very clear memory of waiting at a stoplight and thinking in that moment, I it would be so cool to be an expert in one thing. And for me, I want that to be storytelling. And here I am. I've been pursuing speaking arts and storytelling in one way or another ever since then.
Well, thank you for sharing that story and just even the way that you articulated your story. I'm like, tell me more, right? Because I think that's a gift in itself, right? To
Thank
capture
you.
attention in that way. So, based on your journey, what are attributes of leaders or mentors that have played a key role in your success?
Found that when it comes to presentations and speaking, one of the most important things an individual can have to really succeed in it is trust. Trust in yourself. Fear is our biggest barrier to effective speaking. And a lot of times that fear comes from a lack of self trust, a lack of believing that I have what it takes, or I'll know the answer to the questions during the Q&A, or I don't need to memorize this perfectly, right? And leaders instill that kind of trust when like I mean I it was my very first professional job. Professionally, I trained as a librarian. And in my very first professional job as a librarian, I had a manager who trusted me implicitly. I mean, I was a new grad, and I was full of ideas because I'd been working as a paraprofessional for years. And I went to this manager and told her all my big ideas. And you know what? She went for it. She let me pursue some things that were risky. They were risky, and she trusted me. And because she trusted me, I took the risks I needed to in order to be successful. And that, like I said, that trust, trust in yourself, trust in others, it affects every area of your life and your professional life, all the way down to when you get up to tell a story, or when you get up to give a presentation, or when you're sitting in a meeting. That trust makes all the difference in the world.
I hear you, and I'm so happy for you that your leader actually created this space for you to implement your ideas because I think that is one of the greatest ways to come up with a practical solution in the workplace is when you actually engage people who are doing the work and seeing the gaps and then able to provide the solutions accordingly, right?
Yeah.
And you touched a little bit on that fear piece. And I think even to this day, I know many colleagues who have the same fear when it comes to presentations, especially like if they feel like they have an accent. And so I know a lot of the work that you do, especially from a DEI perspective with your clients, you work through that. So can you tell us a little bit more about how and what you've noticed?
Touched on one theme that comes up a lot in my work is people who are inhibited or have fear because of their accent or their perceived accent or any kind of vocal affectation. It's a fact that it happens for everyone. It is more common for women because women face vocal bias at a much higher rate than men. And so in conversations I have with my clients, they very often are filled with fear because they think that they sound wrong in one way or another. Whether they think they say too much, or I ramble on, or I talk too fast, or everyone always tells me I'm too quiet, or I'm worried about my accent. And I mean, you wouldn't believe um, how sometimes our perception of ourselves is wildly divorced from reality, and this happens for so many reasons. So those are often conversations I have where I simply ask questions and invite people to reflect objectively about their experience. Objectivity is so important in our relationship with speaking and presenting. And it's so difficult as an individual because we have stories that we carry with us. We have the thing someone said to us 5 years ago after our presentation, right? Like there's just so many. And in the case of accents, a lot of people were bullied as children because of the way they spoke, and that sticks with us. It's one of the reasons why having someone like me is helpful, because I bring a completely different lens and I can help people look at things from a new perspective or present a different perspective. But you asked, what are some of the ways I work through this with people? And I would say the first thing is asking good questions and asking it with a degree of objectivity so that you can reflect on what's accurate. And that comes down to looking at the facts around you that you can observe, and looking for evidence about what's true and what's not regarding your voice and your speaking.
Thank you for sharing that. And it kind of made me think back to a conversation I actually recently had with my father because, like, my parents are immigrant parents, and like he works with a lot of new students coming to Canada, and some of which do have thicker accents. And when I say accents, I say like, well, when you come to like Calgary and people don't have a Vietnamese accent, it's different for them versus if you're in Vietnam and you speak English fluently, like you're considered having an accent in their eyes, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
one of the things that he had shared was that like yeah, like it seems like we all like struggle to understand him when he speaks English because he speaks like extremely quickly and it's not clear. The enunciation piece is so different because how our tongues and everything move for like how we pronounce certain Vietnamese words is different than English. And so it made me think back to okay, like how do we create an internal dialogue where maybe it's not like a me thing and personalize it, but more so I just need to slow down a little bit. I need to be okay with taking that extra time to enunciate, reading the facial cues to see if that person understood. If not, asking questions to be like, okay, like, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. How can like did you understand? Like, how do you equip your clients to have those meaningful conversations so that they are heard and understood?
Said it. You hit the nail on the head when you talked about the internal dialogue. And just simply listening to that dialogue is number one, and listening to the kinds of messages you're sharing with yourself. And then what's important is looking at what you're trying to achieve. So often we attach our voices and our speaking to our personal value as and so if you can see that you're not being understood, it's easy to internalize that as, well, I'm clearly terrible. I'm a terrible person, or whatever, whatever the messages that translates into in your mind or your heart. We attach it to our personal value, and it simply isn't. Anytime we're speaking, we're just trying to achieve a goal. We're trying to be understood. And being understood is number one. And then there's usually a second or a third goal after that. Like maybe I'm trying to educate, or maybe I'm trying to inspire, whatever. But when you can keep your evaluation of the facts directly related to your goal, and keep that very separate from your sense of self or your identity, then you're able to more accurately diagnose what's going on and respond to it without it being an immensely personal thing.
And I know it's much easier said than done, right? I know I'm
Yeah.
definitely guilty for falling to the trap where I'm like, oh, but yeah, that was really helpful. And so I kind of wanted to touch on the piece of when you see certain public speakers, you're infatuated by their style, whether it's their ability to slow certain things down, speed certain things up, their emotions, or whatever it may be. What are maybe 1 to 3 things you've noticed about an effective public speaker?
Such an interesting question. I mean, as you were alluding to, there are so many things that we can affect as a speaker. And you can look at it in a purely technical way, like you were talking about: pitch, pace, pause, projection, inflection, tone color. Those are all the technical skills that you bring to communication. And then there's also, gesture, voice, facial expression. Then there's the purely emotional side, which is what is the feeling I'm bringing to this? What feelings do I evoke? And then there's the messaging side. What are the words I'm saying, and what order am I saying them in? So you can look at it through all these different lenses. And what I think is so interesting about the question, an effective public speaker, is that, okay, well, you tell me, when I say, Angela, what makes an effective public speaker? Like, what are the first 3 things that pop into your head?
For me, I think one of the biggest things is the ability of a person to fluctuate their tone. Because if they're like, it sounds like it's monotone for the whole entire time, like my attention span is gone for some reason.
Mhm.
And then their ability to like pause and then change the rate at which they speak too, right? I'm not
Yeah.
sure if like those are the things you notice too, or
Appreciate those points. I mean, those are the things that create contrast and variety. And that, I mean, contrast, when it comes to speaking, contrast is everything, because it's through contrast that we draw people's attention to different things. Like pause, as you pointed out, is a really effective way to almost like highlight a word or phrase by having space before and after it. And there's all these really interesting things you can do with voice and speaking through the way we shift and paint that contrast and bring color and feeling to our speaking. The trap that we fall into, though, is when you think about effective public speaking, we all have a picture in our head of what that sounds like and looks like. And it's usually a picture that looks a lot like someone like Tony Robbins, right? I mean, it just does. And there's a lot of research that shows that the way we think about persuasive speaking or authoritative speaking or credible speakers, like boom, 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 it lines right up with a very particular type of voice. And the fact of the matter is, like, most of us will just never sound like Tony Robbins. Like either we're like genetically not able to produce those kinds of sounds, or like, I mean, reality is a lot of us are living in places where we don't sound like the dominant voice. Some of us just actually have more quiet voices or whatever. There's just so many reasons why a lot of us will spend our lives trying to sound like the quote unquote perfect speaker, and there will always be a gap. And the reality is, the biggest barrier any one of us faces to effective speaking is our own fear, like our own inhibition, our own insecurities. And the number one thing anyone can do to improve their speaking is building that trust, nurturing that sense of confidence, because that is the foundation to the next level of expression for you. Like step one is to feel secure, confident, trusting, whatever word you want to apply to it. That's step one for everyone. And I firmly believe that once you achieve that, achieving the next level of expression for you is a piece of cake.
Love it. And you talked a little bit about the feeling slash emotion side, and I noticed that not only are some of the more technical things that I noticed, but it's like the energy, and it's not even a specific energy, but it's also like you own your space, whether you have that quiet voice and you're able to articulate yourself in a very concise way, or maybe you're that extroverted person and I'm not, but then I'm like, wow, I wish I had an ounce of that energy, right? So like owning that space, I think, is something that you do very well with your clients. And I wanted to switch gears a little bit towards
Sure.
the storytelling piece, right? Because when it comes to speaking and when it comes to presentations and even when you lead, um, being an effective storyteller makes a big difference because people, one understand, okay, what's the key message, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then two, are you telling the story for the sake of adding fluff and distracting me? Or is there actually a reason such as humanizing the message that you're trying to deliver? So based on your experience, what are maybe elements of effective storytelling that you've noticed?
More than anything, telling an effective story is based on shape and structure. Like a story is a particular structure, right? And I mean, it sounds totally grade school, but like a story is, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. There's a character in it, and the character does something, and they're solving some kind of problem. Like that is a story. I'd say to to think really clearly about it, the first thing you can think of is, well, what's the problem? What's the problem in this story? And because it's a problem, a conflict that creates tension, and that's what attracts the audience and keeps them listening. That's why stories work. It's because there's a problem. I mean, think about your favorite story, and think about, when was the problem solved, and how soon after that did the story end? It's usually like more or less immediately. And so for you, like thinking about, like you were talking about, using a story to express a, express your key message, to deliver your key message, like align, just ask yourself, well, what problem is connected to this key message? And that will help you find the story you want to tell in order to express that message.
Thank you. And I think that ties into my next question is because you run a corporate program, right? A corporate story slam program to
I do.
empower a cultural change in organizations and stuff like that. So, can you give us a high level overview of what that looks like?
The purpose of the program is to invite individuals to tell their story, and it's first person story, because as you said, the program is meant to humanize a workforce and to build empathy. And so individuals from across the organization are allowed or invited to join the program, or sometimes it's a team joins the program. The point is there's a group, because then it's in that group environment that people can find and decide on and craft their story. And then we bring everyone together to share their stories with each other. I mean, honestly, Angela, it's such a blast. It's so much fun. And like what I've been doing lately over the last few years is telling this program for the express purpose of creating a more inclusive culture. And specifically, the organization is calling in people who want to tell their story of inclusion. And by sharing these stories of inclusion across the organization, whether it's through their internal social media site, or even in their external marketing materials, or at special events or in team meetings, people are going out to the organization talking about what inclusion means to them through the lens of their experience. So it might be a story about coming out at work, or a story about what someone, a time someone experienced racism at work, and what they did with that, or and it will, whatever there's stories from allies talking about why they wanted to become an ally. It's everything and anything under that umbrella of inclusion. And what's special about it is the individual gets to go through the process of deciding, well, what is my inclusion story, which is thoughtful and reflective, and then craft that intentionally. And then by sharing it within this group of people who've all committed to the same process of telling their inclusion story, it's just this like wonderful event of sharing humanity, and then sharing it across the org allows other people to experience those stories, and in doing that, see how we're all very alike and how we're all very different, which is, it's special. It's so much fun for me.
I can imagine how fun it would be, especially like I'm sure each room you walk into, you don't know what story you're gonna get, right? You don't know what the dynamic's gonna be, and I think it just creates such a space, especially if leaders take the time to actually listen and decision makers to be like, okay, so what are the types of stories that are being shared for one? How are we as a company measuring up to how we continue to foster this environment as a second? And then how do we then continue on to create space for people to bring up any additional stories that they have, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's so much about creating that space, because it takes an immense amount of trust and vulnerability to be able to share your story. And that's one of the things we've worked on fostering and creating.
And this ties into my next question because that safe space, being heard, being seen, ties into have reaching your potential ultimately. So I guess based on your experience, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of this question? What does it take to unleash the potential of an individual or an organization?
I do have a strong opinion about this from the individual perspective. And I think that does scale up to the org. For an individual to reach their potential, I do deeply believe that that individual needs to feel comfortable, confident, and able to fully express themselves. And I see this time and again where there's an individual who, they might have a really great idea or comment to contribute in a meeting, and they don't feel comfortable contributing their comment. Well, how does that limit their a team's ability to solve a problem in that meeting? Just as an example, or you might have an individual who avoids every speaking assignment they get because they're so nervous about speaking. Well, guess what? Then the organization isn't going to get to hear that individual's ideas. Not to mention the fact that then when they go home, they're feeling ashamed, or say they did give their presentation, but then they go home and they can't sleep that night because they're going over and over and over it in their mind, right? There's so many ways that fear around self-expression and speaking limits and creates real pain for the individual. And just imagine how that affects the team, and then that team within the organization. I've spoken to so many leaders who say, my team they're not conveying what they need to convey in these cross-functional meetings. Or when my team members give presentations, they're not showing the real passion or the real or people just simply aren't understanding the complexity of these concepts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Our ability to convey our ideas in a way that we can feel confident in and proud of means so much. And then, I often think about how would your job trajectory be different if you felt completely confident expressing yourself or showing up in a job interview or and I often think, well, if everyone felt really confident, then I think we would be more likely to all be in the right place. And the thing about it is that, like, these are problems that really can be solved, and it is not that complicated. Um so so i i I mean, it's totally biased. Obviously, I feel this way because, like, what I do is help people speak and communicate with each other. But I do feel it deeply. I really do. Not to mention just the joy that comes in self-expression. It's very joyful and beautiful.
I wanted to double click on something real quick. So you mentioned,
I love that you just said double click.
yeah,
I'm gonna steal that.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let's
I heard it from one of my other guests. I'm like, I'm gonna take that away. Or they'll be like,
nice.
I want to zoom in on this. I'm like, visually, I like that.
I
Um,
can see it.
yes. And one of the things that you mentioned is sometimes a leader will go to you and say, hey, like, my team members are not representing themselves the way that they could, especially from a cross-functional perspective. And at the end of the day, that can be career limiting for you, but it also affects like your leader's image, right? Because at the end of the day, let's be real here. When you do great work and it's known, it reflects well on your leader, which then reflects back well on your team and yourself, right? So when a leader comes to you and they're like, you know what, Jilliane, my team is really struggling. What's maybe one piece of advice or an exercise that you'd be like, okay, here's a quick like 5-minute thing that you can do with your team to set them up for success, and then hopefully they'll go and speak.
Thank you for asking that question. And can I share two,
Yes,
please?
yeah.
Okay.
Whatever is top on your mind.
So, number one, the easiest thing everyone can do, like, please push pause and do this right now, is go into your calendar and look at the meetings that make you feel anxious or the presentations that you have coming up, and book 15 minutes before off. Like, please, it's the simplest thing, and it makes the biggest difference. Use that 15 minutes. And hey, if you only have five, book five. Like, do what you can, but give yourself that buffer so that in that time you and please don't spend that time reading your presentation over and over and over again. That activity, this comes back to self-trust. Trust yourself that you know your information, and the activity of reading it over and over a million times will amplify your anxiety. Instead, just breathe, go for a walk, just listen to one of your favorite songs, maybe do some stretches, do things that will help lower any tension that you're feeling, and know that it's normal to feel tension. That is completely normal. Yeah, you're breathing heavy. Yeah, your heart rate has gone up. That makes sense. Embrace it and let yourself just say, this is okay. Say, I'm so excited. So that's number one. And a leader can advise that their team, in fact, imagine how permission giving it would be for the individual to hear their leader say, I know you're giving a presentation in this meeting. Please take the half hour before this meeting just to go for a walk if you need to. Imagine how wonderful that would feel for the team member to have the leader embrace that and support that. So that's number one. Number two, and I'll be brief, but number two is think about the language you use when you give your team member feedback on their presentation and speaking. And I'd invite you to do two things with that feedback. Number one, really accept the reality that there's no good and bad when it comes to speaking. There's no success or failure. There's no, this was awful and that was great. Like, there's no right and wrong. There just isn't. And when you use the language of right and wrong, you're setting your team member up to have more anxiety, because that language of black and white, of right and wrong, creates this dichotomy that essentially at that point they have 50-50 odds of success or failure. And that's just a lie. It's just not true. So soften your language rather than telling someone they should do something, say, I have an idea, right? It's just softening the language. So there's no right and wrong. And then the next thing to think about in your language is how can I always look at this from a lens of positivity? Because we know it's just a fact that positivity is what drives success. There's a very good chance that the feedback you give will stick in that person's mind for the next 20 years. So let that be something positive. Challenge yourself to always think, what is this person fantastic at? What are they great at? And make sure you share that. That's going to take them farther than the very like directive nitpicky advice that's like, oh well, you should really make this gesture on that slide, or make sure you make eye contact when you deliver this line, right? like those types of things they're just so much less helpful.
Thank you for those tips. And when you talk about like the nitpicky to the point where you're like, do this gesture, make the eye contact here, and then the people forget what they're supposed to be saying in terms of the meat of the content because they're so
Yeah,
focused on
exactly.
everything else that
Yeah.
maybe has a smaller impact than the message that they ultimately need to communicate, right? So, as we wrap up our conversation, I have one last question for you, and that's what is one thing that you're working on that you're super excited about?
Thanks for asking that question. And it really is the storytelling program that I talked about earlier. I'm just so thrilled about it. Like most recently, one of the stories that was developed in the program was shared at the company town hall. And how wonderful is that everyone in the org got to hear this individual's story. And in this case, it was someone living with a visible disability and how they built comfort and confidence in that. And so it's just so rewarding to be able to help individuals develop these stories and share them in order to build empathy and help everyone in the org see the humanity of each individual in the workplace is so rewarding. I absolutely love it.
I can understand why it's rewarding, right? Because at the end of the day, as we get more automated in a lot of processes, or there's a lot more cuts or whatever that needs to be managed at work, the changes and stuff like that, being able to maintain that humanity is essential to that thriving workforce. But also, just as on an individual level, right? Like you said, like having an opportunity to actually feel empowered to express yourself, I think makes the world of a difference, especially as an adult, right? We're like, we spend a lot of our lives as a kid maybe not expressing ourselves, right? But then you grow up and you finally have the opportunity, but then you're like, how? Right? So thank you for the great work that you do. I appreciate the advice that you've shared today. And to everyone else that has tuned in to another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate you, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.